All right, good evening. I'm glad you're here. Let me explain a little bit about what's happening. You see, the stage is in the process of a redesign, and chairs have been rearranged a bit. Maybe you've heard about the conference that we have coming up. It's called the Children's Ministry Expo. It is here on our campus this Friday. It's an all-day conference. Um, you know, I can I can I can say these things because I have nothing to do with them. But let me tell you a little bit about what's going on around here because it's really easy at Evergreen to be so involved in certain areas that you're really oblivious to other things that happen, among our people. Last weekend we had an event called The Weekend. It is a student ministry event, and it is put on by Evergreen. It's led by our leadership, and it has grown year after year simply because our guys just do such a first-class job, and God has really blessed it. This year, registration was so big that we had to move it. It wasn't on our campus. It was at the Broken Arrow Performing Arts Center. We had more than 1,000 teenagers from 22 different churches. This is an Evergreen event, but it has become the largest student ministry event in the state of Oklahoma this year outside of Falls Creek. It's easy if you're not involved in student ministry to have no idea what's going on in those kinds of ways. I don't know the total number of teens that came to know Christ this last weekend, but there were 4 salvations just from our church. Now we're here coming up this Friday is what we call the Children's Ministry Expo. Again, this is something that has happened for a number of years, and even through the pandemic and through some snowy weather that we've had in recent years, it has kind of struggled, and we've just been diligent to help do it. Christina Linson is the primary driving force behind this event. But this year, God has really blessed the efforts of our team, and this Friday on our campus, this event, I think we have people from like 8 states that will be here, and our registration closed this afternoon with a final count of 562 people. So here's my point. None of this is bragging. My point is, just read your worship folder. Try and be aware of things that are happening through Evergreen, at Evergreen, among Evergreen, even if it's not something that you're a part of, because your prayer support and your what you do as a part of this body is an important piece of how these things happen and how God is really blessing here. It's easy to judge a church by numbers. How big is their budget? How much offering was there on Sunday? How many people attended Sunday school? You can evaluate a church statistically. We do that in most denominations because it's the easiest way to quantify things. But the reality is a church is not the sum total of its statistics. The church is the sum total of its spiritual impact in a city. And that's what we are striving to have here. I wanted to kind of outline some of these events and let you have a sense of what's happening here, because we're in a series of lessons on Wednesday evenings from the book of Daniel, and tonight we really finish this backward look. Remember, I've told you that the book of Daniel, 12 chapters long. The first 6 chapters look backward to ancient history, the time of the Babylonians, the conquest of the Babylonians by the Medo-Persian Empire, the rise of influence that God gave to Daniel as he was shown favor and continued a lifetime in exile, basically, being a man of God in a pagan culture. Tonight we finish that first half, that backward look, and then beginning next week, It's what I've called History Future, because we begin with the visions that Daniel records of what will happen in the end of human history. And so it's really been, at least for me, it's been fun in these first 6 chapters, teaching stories that are very familiar. You know about Daniel and his friends not accepting the king's dietary requirements. You know about Nebuchadnezzar falling victim to insanity and acting like a piece of cattle for 7 years. You know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And tonight, one of the most familiar stories in the entire Bible. If you grew up in church or if you attended Vacation Bible School when you were a child, chances are Daniel in the lion's den was probably one of the very first Bible stories you ever heard. We're going to look at that tonight, and we're going to see what we can draw here that's fresh. I love to remind people that I don't care how familiar you think a story is, be careful to work through the actual words that God has given us, because there are always things that we thought we knew that are not correct, and there are also things that we didn't ever pay attention to that we see for the very first time. So there's no part of Scripture that is so familiar that we don't need to find our way there again. But these events that God is doing, He's at work at Evergreen, and He is choosing to use us to have an influence and an impact in the lives of other churches and in the lives of people who live in this community. As that continues to happen, I'm convinced one of these days we will be too much on the radar of people who don't like what we do here. And so there are lessons like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel and the lion's den, that we need to go to and remind ourselves they are not just nifty VBS stories for children. They are included here to prepare the people of God in every generation to face what may come in their generation. You've seen, I'm sure, years ago, the movie Chariots of Fire came out. It's the story of Eric Liddell, a Scottish athlete, a rugby football star. He was an Olympic champion in 1924. But that 24 Olympics was a little rocky, because when he arrived at the Olympics as a part of the British track team, he discovered that the 100-meter race that he was scheduled to run was on a Sunday. Because of his commitment to Christ, he informed his coaches that he couldn't run. It was such a controversy that he was actually summoned before the Prince of Wales, the future King of Great Britain, who said this: "Every man is called upon in life to make sacrifices, and your country asks this of you now." To which Liddell replied to his future king, "God knows I love my country, but this sacrifice I cannot make." It's fascinating because Sunday is certainly less than sacred in the modern world. It's barely distinguishable from Saturday or any other day of the week now. And yet, for Eric Liddell in 1924, it was a critical commitment of his faith, even more than the lifelong dream of racing in the Olympics. Out of frustration, the British leadership changed Liddell from the 100-meter race, where he was expected to win gold and maybe set a world record. They switched him to the 400-meter race, an event that he had never trained for. But God, when you stand by God, God stands by you. And in the 400-meter race in 1924, Eric Liddell not only won the gold medal, but he did set a new world record. He died in a Japanese prison camp during World War II, And in his obituary, a leading paper, a national newspaper in Scotland, said this: Scotland has lost a son who did her proud every hour of his life. You see, here's the thing. The world will, in every generation, find what is remaining that is sacred to us. I think the Christians today don't have a long list of things that they refuse to compromise on, and that's part of the reason the church in general is in the shape it's in. But even if we have handed away many of our grandfathers and grandmothers' convictions, the enemy is never satisfied, and so he will motivate the world in every generation to call us in some way that is dear to us. He will call us to compromise. It will sound pious. It will sound noble. In Liddell's case, it sounded even patriotic. But true greatness is reserved for men of integrity who maintain their deepest convictions. In fact, one writer said this, and I don't have a tattoo, but I thought about having this tattooed on my thigh. This is such a good statement. When character equals reputation, there is Christian integrity. See, character is hidden and reputation is public. A lot of people have a reputation that they have carefully cultivated, but it doesn't match who they are in the quiet place of their own lives. But when character equals reputation, that is where we find Christian integrity. That's the setup for Daniel chapter 6. Daniel started as a young man, chapter 1, carried off into exile by the Babylonians. Instantly, in the very earliest days, God showed him favor and allowed him to distinguish himself from the other young men from other captured nations. And Daniel ended up spending his entire life in service to one king after another, never compromising his ultimate loyalty to Yahweh, the one true God, God Most High. His influence was certainly incalculable. And we come to chapter 6, and what we find is that the young man, possibly even the teenager, who was carried off into exile, now nearly 70 years later, is an old man well into his 80s. We don't think about that much in the story of the lion's den, but this was an old man. It would have been easy to say, listen, I fought the good fight. I'm too old for this. I'm not going to any lion's den. Fine. What do you want me to do? What do you want me to say? Who do you want me to bow down to? I'm done. But see, the reality is if you walk with the Lord, it's the story of Polycarp. I mean, basically, Daniel reminds me of Polycarp. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna in the 2nd century, one generation removed from the Apostle John himself. Polycarp, arrested as a bishop, a pastor over a city, taken before the local governor and told that he needs to recant his faith. He needs to swear fealty to Caesar. He needs to walk away from Jesus. He was 86 years old when he got arrested. A man of such stature in his city that when the soldiers finally came to arrest him, he asked their permission to pray, and they twiddled their thumbs for 2 hours and allowed him to pray. Because honestly, I think the Roman soldiers didn't want to arrest him. He was just that godly of a man, and his reputation far preceded their encounter with him. But they did eventually arrest him. They took him to the arena that was filled with citizens thirsty for blood. And the governor said, just respect your age, old man. I mean, just swear to Caesar. I mean, you're embarrassing yourself, frankly. You're too old for this. Just say the words. and I'll let you go. There's no reason for us to have this conflict. And when it was all said and done, Polycarp said, 86 years have I served him. It would be neither right nor safe to walk away from my Lord at this point. Well, they did. They executed the old man right there. Daniel is going to be rescued. Polycarp in that moment wasn't rescued. But what I want you to see is neither story finds its main lesson in the outcome. The lesson is in the faith that both men put on display of absolutely trusting their God to their last full breath. We're going to find in this passage an incredible statement of faith. We tell this story to children and we spend a lot of time talking about lions. The fact of the matter is, when you read Daniel chapter 6, the lions are pretty incidental to the story. This story is not about lions. This story is about an unshakable faith that a man of God had developed, that he had earned, that he had established over the course of a lifetime. And he had no more fear in the face of lions well into his 80s than he did as a brash young teenager when he said, I'm not eating the king's food. I have a different loyalty. I'm not going to eat food sacrificed to pagan gods that implies that I'm their servants. This is a great man. Daniel chapter 6. The enemies of faith attack shrewdly. Verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom to be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, so that these satraps would be accountable to them, and that the king would not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king intended to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel regarding government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption because he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him regarding the law of his God. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows, King Darius, live forever. Listen, anytime somebody approaches you with live forever, be very careful about the next sentence that comes out of their mouth, because they are setting you up. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who offers a prayer to any god or person besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it will not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Thereupon King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Let's talk about the enemies of faith. Daniel was a man of exceptional abilities. I've said he was not young. He's well into his 80s, probably 83 or 84 at this time. He had started as a trainee in government under the eminent and hugely successful Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. His experience extended over at least 60 years of palace intrigue and royal bureaucracy. He was a man fully ripe and strong in his faith in the Lord. The actual persecution that this chapter is going to tell us about was prompted by jealousy toward a person more competent than the rest. You see, Darius comes in, and we'll talk more about Darius next week. But let me just remind you, Babylon sweeps Judah into the pages of history for 70 years. It was an exile that God had instructed for the discipline, for the purification of the nation of Judah. He preserved them in exile and restored them under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, so that the unfolding of the drama of redemption coming through a Messiah could still unfold. I remember Ezekiel was in the countryside with the regular folk. Daniel was scooped up by Nebuchadnezzar and ended up being in the palace. Nebuchadnezzar, after his extensive reign, there were several kings. We saw Belshazzar, his grandson, along the way. That was the handwriting on the wall that we looked at. Belshazzar was the king of Babylon on the night that the Medes and the Persians in alliance finally conquered Babylon and took that superpower down. Now, just some backstory here. The Medes and the Persians were two empires, but in order to take on Babylon, they created an alliance. And part of the way that they secured an alliance that allowed them to trust each other was there was something that came out of the Mede Empire that was adopted by the Persians, and it was this idea that the king was absolute. But in order, it was really designed to work, to be a safeguard originally. They had a law, and the king was really, we say the king could do anything he wanted. Well, the king could do anything he wanted to a degree. Because part of how they established their empire was that the king had absolute authority. He could do anything he wanted. But once he decreed a law, once it was put into place officially, it could never be revoked. Now, you say, well, that's a stupid plan. Well, but think it through. It was designed to be a safeguard. I mean, it was designed to make passing laws, for a king to issue decrees. It was supposed to have such a weightiness because there were no backseas. You couldn't take it back. It was designed to make the process so weighty that kings would think long and hard before issuing it. They would bring their advisors together and they would discuss it and they would word it just right. It's like all those old jokes about the guy that found the genie in the lamp and his wishes didn't turn out right because his language was imprecise. Well, this was meant to drive the kings to a precision of language. So before they issued a law, they were careful to make sure that it was exactly long-term, irrevocably the right thing to do for their people. That was the design. The reality was, we have here Darius. Now, just a side note, there's a lot of controversy over just who Darius was. In the same way that I talked about Belshazzar and the feast that he had, and that the Medes and the Persians tunneled into the city and destroyed Babylon, conquered them on the very night of the feast. I gave you a date. We dated that down to a precise day because secular history outside of Scripture gives us those dates, and Scripture perfectly lines up with what we know from history. But in this instance, history has this gap because we don't have a lot of evidence about who Darius is. We know Cyrus, and Cyrus is going to show up later in the book of Daniel. But But the idea here is that probably what happened is that in the takeover by the Medo-Persian Empire of Babylon, Cyrus was the high king or the emperor. But the empire was so vast. Do you remember me talking about how Belshazzar was a co-regent with his father, Nabonidus? And they actually governed different sections of the empire, and they headquartered themselves in different cities. Well, as the Babylonian Empire was taken over, the Medes and the Persians were faced with the very same issue. The empire was too big geographically to rule from one location. So Cyrus, the emperor that we know about, ruled in one part of the empire. Darius apparently was either a co-regent or a number 2 man that was assigned a particular region where the former capital of Babylon had been. And he apparently has a lot of freedom, because he comes in the beginning of chapter 6 and he says, I need a bureaucracy in the best sense. I need a structure in place if I'm going to rule this region. So he creates this structure where he has 120 satraps. That's just an ancient term that basically describes governors or regional rulers. But as he took his portion of the empire and divided it apparently into 120 regions and assigned a representative of the crown in each of those regions, he couldn't directly supervise 120 satraps, so he created 3 commissioners, positions that were below the king but above the satraps. Those 3 commissioners would have been responsible, probably 40 apiece, more likely however the numbers fell based on natural geographic divisions. Daniel inherited from the Babylonians, but not a Babylonian, was recognized for his giftedness, and God arranged the same favor with the new emperor that he had experienced under the old regime. And so the 3 commissioners, Daniel is made one of them. But see, it doesn't even stop there. The text tells us that Daniel, even at the age of 83 or 84, so distinguished himself, the king was so aware of how this man was head and shoulders more effective, better than anybody else he had, he created a further plan to elevate Daniel to be over the commissioners who were over the satraps. In effect, if you have Cyrus in another part of the empire and you have Darius as his number 2 man, you're talking about Daniel now as the number 2 man under Darius. This hasn't happened to one of God's people since Joseph was given superior position in ancient Egypt. It's a remarkable story. Not only is he a poor kid from a poor country that was carried off into exile as a prisoner of war, but after decades of service to the defeated empire, he smoothly transitions into the new guys and they make him top man. It's nothing short of remarkable when God decides to put favor on the life of a man because he wants him to be in a position of influence. That's what's happened here. Now, when it became clear that the king's plan was to elevate Daniel above the other commissioners, the rivalry of those somewhat less competent, probably competent in their own jobs, but by contrast, less competent, they said, we got to do something about this guy. I mean, we can't have, he's not even one of us, whoever us is. But listen to what they said. They do the deep state investigation. I mean, they look into Daniel's past. They look into his government dealings. They look into everything he's done. See, is there any politician today that we could say this about? It said, Then the commissioners, verse 4, then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel regarding government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption because he was trustworthy and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. That is an epitaph that it doesn't get better than that. The guy had decades in political service with a spotless track record. And so they throw up their hands and they go, well, we're not going to find anything on this guy unless we can find something related to his faithful worship of his God. This is where the shrewdness comes in for the enemies of faith. So they go to the king and they lie to the king, first of all. They lie to him when they say, then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius live forever. Okay, step number one, flatter the king so that he will be more inclined to decree an irrevocable law without thinking it through. Now remember, I said the idea was you get all your advisors and you work through the development of this law or that law so that you can implement something that is just and true and proper that won't come back to bite you. Well, they knew the process, so they started with flattery, but then they lied. Here's the lie. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who offers a prayer to any god or person besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be thrown into a lion's den. Now, the king was an idiot in the sense that he fell for the flattery, first of all. But it wasn't unfair. He should have been smarter. But it wasn't really unfair for him to hear these words. All the commissioners, all the satraps, all the prefects, all the governors, we got together and we have some advice for you. Well, see, that's exactly the way the system was supposed to work. They were supposed to all come together and advise him from a position of agreement. But we know that it wasn't all the commissioners because Daniel didn't know anything about it. The best of the commissioners wasn't in on the process. So they flattered the king, and then they lied to him. And they present him with this idea, again, flattery, that says, we think you should pass this injunction that makes it illegal for anybody to pray to a god besides you for 30 days. Now, let me just help you think through this for a minute. The reason for 30 days was because they were smart enough to know this law will be irrevocable, so we got to build a time limit. We've got to have a sunset clause. So we just need it for 30 days because we can catch this guy Daniel in 30 days. But we're back to flattery now. We think, now see, remember, the Medes and the Persians have just taken over. The kingdom is just being organized. The satraps and the commissioners, these offices are being created, and people are just now being put into their place. So my suspicion is, when they bring this, what probably is the fuller context of this is they're saying, listen, every one of these conquered nations that make up this hodgepodge that is Babylon, they've all got loyalties going in every direction. If we're going to consolidate our victory, we need to have an introductory season where they all pray, in a sense, pray to their gods with you as the visible, tangible human representation of all the gods. Every spiritual loyalty, no matter who it's to, will need to be funneled through you. Because what we're going to do is we're going to consolidate our gains and we're going to bring their loyalty, their political loyalty, will follow their spiritual loyalty. So we're going to have them pray to you so that we can unify the nation. What politician doesn't want to unify the nation? It's a noble goal. We're going to bring people together, and I'm going to be the linchpin of this process. It sounds good. Nobody deserves it more than me because I'm the king. And all of my advisors, every last one of them, are in agreement that this is a good thing. Shrewd strategy. Now, when they went after Daniel, they were envious of his success. I love verse 3. It says that there was an extraordinary spirit in him. They were envious of his success. They were envious of his integrity. As I've said, no mismanagement of funds, no hint of corruption or personal gain, no negligence of duty, no laziness, no questionable activities. We got to try a different tack. They were envious, I think, of his dedication to his God. That was the door they could go through. A man of honesty and integrity and faith angers the world almost more than anybody else because the men of the world suffer by comparison. I don't know that they hated Daniel as a person. They hated Daniel as the example of everything they were not. Their hostility was evident. It's interesting. When you're talking about unbelievers, unbelievers will often compare themselves to each other, and it will become a time of teasing and competitiveness and kind of cheerful bantering back and forth. But when an unbeliever compares himself to a Christian, it's almost never fun for them. That's why in our generation, the world around us so enjoys the downfall of a recognizable Christian. Because when a pastor or a famous leader who has an outspoken Christian testimony, when they fall with a moral failing or some kind of cancelable offense, to use our language, it makes the sins of everybody else seem a little less terrible. A man's relationship to God can be measured by who his enemies are. Never forget that. Well, enemies of faith attack shrewdly, but the man of faith reacts consistently. Here's what happens. They talked the king into this. Verse 9, thereupon King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Here is now an irrevocable law demanding prayer to the king and to the king only for 30 days. Verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the document was signed, see, that's how we know he wasn't in on the committee work that brought the recommendation to the king. He didn't know anything about it. When Daniel learned that the document was signed, he entered his house, and in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and offering praise before his God, just as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel offering a prayer and imploring favor before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any person who offers a prayer to any god or person besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be thrown into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they responded and spoke before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps offering his prayer 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on rescuing Daniel, and until sunset he kept exerting himself to save him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Daniel's a highly placed executive. He's up there in the power structure. When he heard the decree, he knew immediately what the intent was. He knew what this was about. And I think he paused to consider his actions. He paused for all of 3 seconds to decide what he should do. And I think this is his thought process. He had had a strong and an unquestionable testimony his entire life. Now, at the age of 84, he'd spent decades reminding everybody from the king on down that the true God could provide for those who trusted him. If he should now even appear to stop praying to his God, every bit of his previous testimony would be worthless. And so he concludes that the maintenance of his testimony was more important than the continuation of his life. Let me say that again. What if in our lifetime we're faced with this question? What's more important? The continuation of your testimony, the credibility of your testimony, or the continuation of your life? Whether it was Daniel in the empire of the Medes and the Persians, or Polycarp, or Paul, or Peter under the Roman Empire, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer under the Nazis. This is a question that has to be answered. Do I keep my testimony, or do I save my life? Folks, hopefully that's not a choice that comes to us. But if it does, you already need to know what the decision is going to be. Don't wait until you're under the pressure of persecution to figure out where you stand in relation to Jesus. It's already got to be settled. Well, Daniel makes a conscious decision of will. Verse 10 tells us that. This is not an emotional decision. He goes into his house. He opens the windows toward Jerusalem. And we know that this was intentional. He knelt 3 times a day. It says that he did that, offering praise before his God, just as he had been doing previously. This is the verse. Verse 10 is the verse that I get the name of this lesson from. When standing means kneeling. For him to stand on behalf of his God, for him to be true to his conviction, he had to kneel because it had become illegal for him to kneel before his God. You know, there's a man in Great Britain. He's just been released because the courts found that the law was it's not unconstitutional. I don't know what they call it in Britain, but it's not an acceptable law. But this man was arrested because he was standing not across the street from an abortion clinic. He was standing down the block, across the street in the next block from the abortion clinic. Standing there, praying silently. And the police marched up to him and said, why are you here? He said, I'm just standing here and praying. What are you praying about? I'm praying that God will save the lives of the babies that are in that clinic up the street. Silent prayer in the next block away from the abortion clinic. He wasn't blocking access. He wasn't harassing people. He wasn't even trying to talk to people who entered or left. Next block, silent prayer. They arrested him and put him in prison, and he was there for 3 weeks before the judge ruled that the law had no standing and finally released him. You think stories like Daniel in the lion's den are just fascinating little tidbits from the ancient world? This is today's headline. This is where we live. When I talk to you about persecution, I know people look at me and they're like, dude, seriously, you are overreacting. That's never going to happen here. Never going to happen here. I can take you through instances in America, but certainly in Canada, in Great Britain, across Europe, certainly in China. The faith is under assault. But guess what? Like Daniel, like Polycarp, like Peter and Paul, believers are still digging their heels in and saying, I don't care. I've settled this issue. He made a conscious decision of his will. Our religion has to be based not on our emotion. We can't say, well, I don't feel like doing that. It can't be based on our preferences. I don't like it done this way. It can't be based on our conveniences. I don't have time for that. Bottom line is we are called to live by what is true. And what is true is not up for debate. He was alone in prayer 3 times a day. This was his custom apparently for decades. There's another whole lesson there that I can't get into, but I'll just summarize it this way. Even the best of God's saints know that they cannot survive without time alone with God. You are never strong enough to tell God you'll get back to him whenever you need him. That's why we talk about daily time in prayer and the Word. He had a regular habit in a regular place. That's how they knew how to find him. But he didn't change it. He didn't try and hide. He didn't try and go somewhere else. He just kept doing what he had always done. So they go back to the king. And they say, hey, king, I know we were just here. Refresh our memory. Didn't you sign this injunction that can't be reversed? The king says, yeah, I did that. You were just here. We just had this conversation. I did that. And they say, oh, well, here's the bad news. We've already caught our first person breaking the law. Oh, yeah? Who is it? It's that guy Daniel. Now, listen, he's been in Babylon, Medo-Persia, almost 70 years. And they're still calling him Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah. Now, what I like about that is that for all of those decades of service, he is still identified with the identity of who he is in relation to the true God. He wasn't the Daniel who's been around Babylon for a long time. He was the Daniel who came from Judah, who is still to this day worshiping that God of Judah. Well, here's the results of faith. Look at verse 26. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and thrown into the lion's den. Oh, don't forget verse 14 and 15. The king was beside himself, and he searched for every conceivable loophole to get this reversed. And there's just no way out. The system was designed to not leave him a way out because the system didn't want a king flippantly making laws and flippantly going back on them. Well, flippantly making laws was exactly what had happened here. Verse 16, then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and thrown into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, your God whom you continually serve will himself rescue you. And a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed regarding Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Okay, now we're not looking in the lion's den yet. Okay, that verse is still to come, but you know the story. So here's what I love about that verse. Who got the better night's sleep, Daniel or the king? The king didn't sleep a wink. I love that phrase. That's exactly what the Hebrew says. That's a great translation. His sleep fled from him. He was chasing it, but he couldn't get it. Oh, sleep fled from him. Verse 19. Then the king got up at dawn at the break of day and went in a hurry to the lion's den. And when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king began speaking and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you continually serve been able to rescue you from the lions? Okay, let's pause for effect. Okay? Let's pause right there. Daniel made a decision to stand by God, even in this crisis. God is going to make it clear that he's going to stand by Daniel. Why do you think it feels like God doesn't do more for us? I just want to throw this out there. Could it be because we often abandon him at the first sign of difficulty or struggle? Boss wants me to work on Sunday. Okay, well, I have to work on Sunday. I can't take a stand. I might lose my job. You want to know why God doesn't do something dramatic in your life? You don't allow him to leave you in a position where something dramatic from God is called for. When we bail out up front, we say, well, I'd love to have some sort of miraculous rescue, but, in order to get a miraculous rescue, you've got to be in an unsolvable dilemma. And we're pretty adept at not letting ourselves get into those unsolvable dilemmas. It may be Sunday, that's what it was with Eric Liddell, but it may be something else. We're far too quick to say, I didn't want to do that, but what are you going to do? It was out of my hands. Folks, your convictions are never out of your hands. Either you got them or you don't. Don't tell yourself you have them if they don't do you some good in a tough situation. Daniel was a personal witness to unbelievers for decades, even to the point Darius hasn't been in charge very long. We're talking weeks, maybe a few months at most. He's still building the bureaucracy of his new government. And yet he already has this deep devotion. This pagan king has a deep devotion to Daniel because he sees how he's different from everybody else available to him. You are the best Christian somebody knows. Well, this justice is skewed. Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. The king does not have a good night. And then verse 20, this verse that we finished with, I want to pause here. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you continually serve been able to rescue you from the lions? Has your God been able to deliver you? Folks, that is the question of the world in every generation. All right, verse 21. If I was Daniel, I've paused right here long enough for the king to sort of give up hope. That's just my imagination. I don't even think that's sanctified. That's just me. Verse 21. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me since I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very glad and gave orders for Daniel to be lifted up out of the den. So Daniel was lifted up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The world's question is, has your God been able to deliver you? And the believer's answer is, my God sent an angel to do just that. Now, that'd be a great ending to the story. But there's more. Verse 24. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they threw them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. That's pretty graphic. You know, it bothers us in our enlightened sensibilities, this idea of children and wives being punished in the ancient world. But you have to understand, in the ancient world, particularly in the pagan ancient world, one of the great threats to any head of state, any emperor, any king, anybody in charge, one of the great threats was the vengeance of family members of those who had been executed by the king. So entire families were executed because the pagan kings couldn't afford to allow the innocent child of this person that he just executed to grow up and become his enemy. Now, what makes the followers of God different? Do you remember? This is a side note, but let me just go there. Do you remember? They couldn't believe after Saul died and David became king, David didn't wipe out the household of Saul. Are you out of your mind? You can't let the family members of a previous king, somebody's going to grow up and claim the throne because they're going to say they're the rightful heir, that you're a usurper. You can't let them live. Well, what's the difference between Darius, a pagan king, wiping out the family of all these advisors that have to suffer punishment because he can't afford to have their family grow up and be his enemies, and David? The difference is David didn't come to the throne until it was God's time, and David was diligent. I'm not touching Saul. This is in God's hands. It's God's timing. The way my life unfolds, it's in God's hands. And David looked at those and said, I'm not going to commit murder. My life is no less in God's hands now that I'm king than it was before. You see, the difference between pagan belief and faith in the true God, it's radical in every detail. We are foundationally different than the way the world operates. And it plays itself out in every detail. Verse 25. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages who were living in all the land. Now that's pretty comprehensive. All the peoples, all the nations, all the populations of all the languages who were living in all the land. Everybody got the word. I issue a decree that in all the realm of my kingdom people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He rescues, saves, and performs signs and miracles in heaven and on earth. He who has also rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Wow. Remember, here's a pagan king. We haven't heard anybody talk about Daniel's God like this since Nebuchadnezzar came to himself. A lot has happened since the old man Nebuchadnezzar died, but if there's anything here, Darius is discovering the true God. This is not, remember, he's not talking about Daniel the way those other kings did. Well, he's got the spirit of the gods. He's got, blah, blah, blah. He's using biblical and theologically accurate language, which means He was learning who Daniel's God was. Verse 28. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Darius was a Mede, Cyrus was a Persian. It was some kind of dual arrangement. All right? It's a great story. The lions. An angel came and closed their mouths. I wonder if God didn't whisper in their ears, don't eat my servant Daniel, but come morning, there'll be a feast. Folks, the bottom line of this chapter, it's not about lions. It's about when a man decides to live out his convictions, come hell or high water. And the credibility of his testimony is more important than the continuation of his life. That is our takeaway. Father, thank you so much for this story. Often relegated to Vacation Bible School, the reality is there are few stories in the Bible much more impressive than this one. Father, it challenges us to rise to a whole new level in our own faith, our willingness to walk with you. Lord, I pray that when your eyes roam to and fro across the earth, as you tell us in Chronicles, as you seek to find those whose hearts are completely yours, Father, we pray that when your eyes land on this place called Evergreen, that's precisely what you will find. Lord, we don't seek persecution. We don't strive for it. We don't have a martyr complex. But Father, if that day comes, let us be a people who are firm, who are settled, who find ourselves standing with the great heroes of the past and saying, all my life I followed him. I can't do anything different at this point. My God is my God. Find that among a people called Evergreen. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.